Welcome to our immigration webinar on the current and future landscape of migration during COVID-19. My name is Sarah Pettit and I'll be your host for the next hour along with my panel. And I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. A special hello to our Melbourne colleagues. We hope you're doing well and keeping in high spirits. I'd like to welcome our panel of experts this morning. We have Samantha Norman, Maree Elliott and Chanesman. We are excited to take you through the impacts the current travel restrictions are having on employers' global mobility programs and the ability to access highly skilled foreign workers. Our panel will take you through the current and likely future impacts of these restrictions for Australia and the economy more broadly. So if you have any questions throughout the discussion, please pop your question into our chat box. I'll be monitoring these during the discussion, and at the end we'll be able to talk through them with the panel. If we do run out of time today, we will prepare an FAQ and send that round to you after the session based on those questions. So before we get into the discussion, I would like to introduce you to our panel. Firstly, we have Samantha Norman. Samantha is based in our Queensland office and has over 16 years experience in the migration profession, having assisted corporate and individual clients in a variety of industries such as IT, finance, health, mining, oil and gas, defense, to name a few. I won't keep going, I'll be here forever. So Samantha, over the last 5 months, has had wonderful success in obtaining travel exemptions into and out of Australia for our corporate and individual clients who are coming here to work or live. Her determination to achieve a positive outcome for our clients is second to none, and I look forward to hearing more from Samantha on the current state of travel exemptions. Secondly, we'll have Maree Elliott. Maree's based in our Queensland office also and brings a wealth of knowledge and experience over 30 years in the migration profession. Maree's experience includes working with large mining organisations, hotel groups, major restaurants, aerospace and IT. Her list goes on too, just like Samantha's, where she assists employees moving into Australia as well as assisting individuals. Maree is the foremost expert in global talent and distinguished talent visas and assisting highly skilled professionals in migrating to Australia. I look forward to hearing from Maree today on all that is global talent. And finally, we'll have Chanesman. Chanesman and Partners is a specialist firm widely recognised in Australia as Australia's labour agreement experts. The cornerstone of this business is built on Alan's expertise and reputation, and he's been in the migration law field for almost 20 years. He is foremost an immigration advisor, policy expert and commentator. Alan is the migration industry's most accomplished and knowledgeable labour agreement expert. So I'm very excited to hear from Alan today, as we all are on the panel. So thank you for joining us, Alan, and we're excited to hear from you. If for those who are joining in who haven't worked with me or don't know me, my name is Sarah Pettit. I'm based in Mappion's Perth office, and I've been in migration for 15 years now, predominantly assisting corporate clients with moving their people globally around and into Australia and also out of Australia. And most recently in the last 12 to 18 months, very heavily in the marine sector, assisted by my team in Perth. So I look forward to speaking with everyone today and sharing our insights around all that are travel exemptions, other visa pathways, and what the economy is going to look like and the skilled labour shortage. So I'll stop talking for a change and I'll hand over to Samantha, and hopefully you enjoy the discussion. I just, obviously before we go in, can everyone hear me okay? Is there anyone in the chat box that can't hear me? You can just leave a message. Otherwise, I'll hand over to Samantha now.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. So here we are. Let's have a chat about travel exemptions. So I imagine everybody knows what they are. The borders are all closed. It's a bit tough at the moment. So temporary residents, partners of Australian citizens and residents, skilled people wanting to come in all need to apply for a travel exemption before they can enter. Australian citizens wanting to leave the country also need to apply for a travel exemption to depart. Those are quite tough to obtain. And I have to say, we haven't really had a lot of involvement with outbound exemption requests. It's primarily been the inbound that we've been looking at. So policy is still evolving. It's a bit of a fluid space to be working in. There are some positive changes that have happened more recently that I'll go through in a little bit. But between beginning of February and late June, there have been around 10,000 outbound exemptions approved and 10,500 inbound exemptions approved in that space. So 6,700 of those were related to transits. Sorry, I've just been asked to move over a bit because you can only see half of me. You want the full experience. And 1,740 have been for compassionate grounds, which then leaves, this is the statistical exciting part, around 311 for critical skills for medical professionals, 890 critical skills that fall into the other category, and 165 on average for business leaders, diplomats, students, medevac patients, temporary protection visa holders, and safe haven visa holders. But the focus today is primarily on the critical skills sectors and what that looks like and what you need to do. So Sarah could tell you at the end all about Maritime Crew. So Maritime Crew and airline crew are automatically exempted. But for Maritime Crew, that usually only applies when they have a Maritime Crew visa. So if they're on a 400 or a 600 visa, it all goes a little bit pear-shaped. And Sarah and our very experienced Perth team have become our experts in that space. But critical sectors and critical skills, the ABF has put some fairly good guidance online now. So the circumstances that would generally meet the requirements for a travel exemption include people invited by the federal government to assist with COVID-19 or by a state territory government, people providing critical or specialist medical services, people with critical skills that will help maintain the supply of essential goods and services, people delivering services in sectors critical to Australia's economic recovery where there is no Australian worker available, and that part is quite important. People providing critical skills in religious or theology fields, or someone whose entry would otherwise be in Australia's national interest. And that sort of falls into a slightly different policy area, I would think. But as Sarah said, we've helped quite a lot of clients in recent months. We've needed multiple attempts in some cases, but for the most part, we've had good results, and you know, we've got a pretty healthy approval rate. So you know, we're developing our expertise on the run, much like immigration is developing its policy on the run. But what we found is really important is just drilling down into what those categories actually mean. So some are quite obvious. If you're invited by the Australian government to assist with COVID-19, specialist medical services, that's probably fairly obvious. But the other sort of critical skills spaces, I think there's a little bit of ambiguity in there, in that there is some room for movement within reason. So critical skills required to maintain the supply of essential goods and services, there isn't a restricted list as such, I don't think, but the eligible industries are listed as including medical technology, critical infrastructure, telecommunications, engineering and mining, supply chain logistics, agriculture, primary industry, food production, and the maritime industry. And then sectors critical to Australia's economic recovery are listed as including financial technology, large-scale manufacturing, film, media, television production, and emerging technology. And the film, media, television production is quite interesting, and I think is off the back of the investment that the Morrison government announced a few weeks ago into getting that industry back on its feet. But in those sectors, there is an expectation that there would be no Australian worker available to do that work. And I think that scrutiny will only increase as unemployment keeps rising as well. So those are the primary focus industries. But like I said, I don't believe they're meant to be prescriptive as such. And we have had approvals come through for clients that don't necessarily neatly fit in those sectors. There's a little bit of nuance in there that you might be able to play around with. So some of the occupations we've had approved across our team have included, it's kind of a long list, so bear with me, agreement manager, helicopter pilot, health and safety advisor, technical sales manager, operational superintendent, mining engineers, geotechnical engineers, metallurgists, procurement manager, supply and distribution manager, senior service engineers, HR manager, meteorologists, construction project manager, cybersecurity consultants, finance manager, ICT implementation specialists under the 400 visa, high voltage cable jointers also under the 400 visa, and commissioning engineers. We've also received approvals for non-resident spouses of Australian citizens wanting to come in and reunite with their family, but there's a lot of talk and chatter around that particular area at the moment because there's been a lot of refusals, and there are a lot of families of Australian citizens still stuck offshore trying to come in. But I believe Michael Outram this week said he's going to start reviewing the decision-making processes for those cases. So most of the approvals that we've had have related to TSS 482 applications, some for 400 visas for short stay specialists, and some for direct entry permanent residence applications. But in each case, they've obviously been offshore. So I have seen some chatter that employers should just give up on trying to get people from overseas in the current climate, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. If you know you have a really genuine need for someone from offshore, if you've tested the market, you know you can't get those skills here, then it's worthwhile considering still proceeding. You just need to look really carefully about whether there's enough merit to support that process. So you need to factor in time. So really hard to advise people at the moment on how long it would take from identifying a candidate to actually having them on shore. There are backlogs building within the processing centres, but priority is being given to offshore applicants who have a travel exemption. If you're confident or reasonably confident of approval of the travel exemption, lodge the visa application, lodge the travel exemption request. When you get the travel exemption request approved, then you use that to ask the processing centres to finalise the visa applications for you. And that's been quite good. It's sort of a long lead in time, but when the ABF exemption comes through, we've found emailing the TSS teams in particular, it's usually 3 to 5 days for the visa approval to follow. They can help for 400 visas in having biometrics waived as well. Some posts will consider that if the travel exemption is in place, then that automatically negates the need for a biometrics test to be conducted, because in certain locations, applicants just can't get those tests done at the moment. So what you generally need to look at, and what we believe the overarching consideration is that the circumstances supporting the request outweigh any potential risk to the Australian community. So you really have to have a well-articulated argument as to why this person should be given the travel exemption. And it's a bit like War and Peace. You have to put together quite a good story. Less is more does not apply when you're applying for a travel exemption. So if you think you've got enough information, add a bit more. Anything you can find that would show the contribution that the business is making to economic recovery, the skills the person has, if it's a growth industry, if there are, well-documented historic shortages. So even though unemployment might be rising, you still may not have, a pool of talent in Australia that you can get these skills from. So what else have we found? Financial impacts on the business, that's probably good to look at. Like, will there be any if you can't fill the role? Will you not be able to deliver on a project? Would there be job losses for locals if, you can't fill that vacancy, if it's a growth or strategic role that will help build your business? We tend to just, bombard the travel exemptions team with as much information as we can, and hope for the best. And so far so good. They've all been getting approved. As I said, some will get refused. Try again with a little more information. So what happens when you've got your ABF approval? It's not all over, because it depends on where they're going in Australia. So as we all know, living here, it's like having 8 different countries in one at the moment. You can't just pop across the border and have a little holiday. Like my Lennox Head plans for the September holidays are off the cards. Boo. But for people coming in from overseas, so Western Australia is a good example. You'll have your ABF exemption approved, but then you also need to get approval from the WA Police Commissioner for those people to enter WA. So you need to do that after ABF approval, but it's just another process to follow. Generally, I think if the ABF approval has come through, the Western Australia approval should follow without any issue. Really important to let people know to expect 14 days quarantine, to expect, to be met by the various state police authorities or ABF officials, to be escorted from airside to hotel. And there are some difficulties. Victoria's not accepting international arrivals. So if you've got an approval for someone to come in, you'll have to bring them in via Sydney or Brisbane, wherever it may be, and then look at domestic relocation once they've done their quarantine. Tasmania, I think, is also pretty much closed, but it does have similar exemptions to the ABF for critical skills and sectors. The other thing to note is unemployment obviously is going up and will go up even more before, everybody starts to recover. So when you're looking at offshore candidates in the current climate, generally you'll need to really be able to substantiate why you need to bring that person in from overseas and why you need those skills. But that will be looked at, I think, quite heavily on the travel exemptions as well. So if you have got evidence of trying to recruit locally, or evidence of employing locals in the lead up to making that offer to an overseas candidate, then you should include that with the travel exemption request as well. So it's almost like voluntary labour market testing before you make an approach for approval. It will be a bit like what we saw during the GFC. Immigration will be looking at things really carefully, as we go forward, and that will trickle down to the TSS program as well. Not so much the 400s, I don't think, because they've got their own distinct purpose, but been some good changes recently. There's been a few swings and roundabouts from when they first came in. So initially you could apply for the travel exemption, wait for the approval, then take the visa process forward with certainty that, making that investment in time and money would be worthwhile. Then without notice it changed, and visas, travel exemption approvals were being refused because the person didn't hold a visa. That was the rationale for the refusals. So it's changed again now in recent weeks that you can request the travel exemption before the visa is granted, and as I said earlier, you can then use the travel exemption approval to ask for the visa to be finalised. So the TSS processing teams in particular are prioritising approvals for offshore applicants who hold a travel exemption. So you won't get a lot of traction unless you've got that approval email in your hands. We have a new travel exemptions dedicated processing team that have been formed in WA, and what was previously the exclusive decision-making power of the commissioner has been delegated now across that team, with varying levels of responsibility for the ultimate decision-making. That will help, and in the coming weeks they will be issuing some really good detailed guidance for different industries to use when thinking about whether they want to try to get one of these through. I think mining and resources are the initial focus, and then other industry information packs will follow. There is a really good inquiry line on the portal section of the immigration website. So if you're in an industry that's not necessarily covered by the ones that are listed, it is worthwhile submitting a query through that portal, and one of the industry liaison officers should come back to you and have a chat with you about what it is that you need and whether or not they think it's worthwhile and what you would need to provide to get that approval through. So it's reassuring to see that it's sort of coming together after a time. But as I said earlier as well, in the chat that I had recently with one of the liaison officers, he did acknowledge that, you know, it's such an unknown circumstance and so new to everyone that it really is evolving constantly over time. But the only other thing to note is currently there's no charge from immigration for submitting the requests, but there is speculation that that might change in the future. So we'll have to wait and see. New Zealand has recently introduced fees for requesting these, so Australia may follow. We'll wait and see. So I'll hand over to Maree in a second, but I think just generally backlogs are building. They'll probably get worse. There will be increased scrutiny on applications as we go forward, certainly over the next 6 or so months, I would think, before recovery starts to happen. So it's probably also worthwhile looking at what other visa options are available outside of the sponsored space, which, you know, brings us to Maree, who'll talk through the global talent individual visa, which is a really good option for certain industries and, you know, highly skilled individuals. So, Maree.
Sorry, we just have to keep our social distance and we have to get centralised here. So, hi everyone. So we're talking today about the Global Talent Independent Program. It falls within the Distinguished Talent Visa Program, which is the subclass 124 for offshore and the 858 for onshore. And it has two streams, the Global Talent Independent stream and the Global Talent Employer Sponsored stream. Today we're focusing on the Global Talent Independent stream simply because in the current climate, businesses are not going to be too inclined to maybe sponsor as much as what they've done in the past. And so the Global Talent Independent is an attractive option for very highly skilled individuals who may want to come to Australia. The program was introduced in October 2019, and evidence of how much the government is supporting the program is that they've got 6 overseas global talent offices based. This is pre-pandemic. I'm not quite sure if they're still all there, but hopefully they're not. They will be soon. So they were based in Berlin, Dubai, Santiago, Singapore, Shanghai, and Washington. The benefits of this visa is that it's a permanent visa and it's processed under the Distinguished Talent Visa Program, as I've mentioned. There are no restrictions on age or occupation. So, you know, for anyone that's over 50 that thinks that their options have left, if they're highly skilled and if they've got a nominator in Australia, they can still come in. The visas are expedited, so they have priority processing, and they can reside anywhere in Australia. So somebody that applies for a global talent visa is not restricted to any state or to any employer. So that's another benefit of the visa, that you know, a person can go wherever the employment is. The global talent visa also has lower English requirements. So a person only needs functional English, so they just have to be able to say hello, goodbye, and how you going, I think, just about to get a functional English. And it's the Global Talent has an Australian-based support team, which is a whole government effort. So you've got all of the state governments and all the federal government supporting the scheme. So, as mentioned, it has 2 pathways. Both pathways require an expression of interest. So the benefit of this visa is also that you can lodge the expression of interest. Doesn't cost anything to do that. Obviously, if you're an agent, you'll be charging to do it, but for the applicant, there's no fees involved in terms of visa charges. And at least you get an indication of, well, yes, it's going to proceed because you get an invitation, or no, you haven't got a chance because you don't get invited. So it's a really good way of gauging whether or not you're going to be able to apply. It is for highly skilled and internationally recognised in seven target areas, including agtech, space and advanced manufacturing, fintech, energy and mining technology, medtech, cybersecurity, quantum information, advanced digital, data science and ICT. And I'm sure that anyone who has all those qualifications must be very bright, because I don't even know what half of that stuff means, but I would find out. The other thing with these visas is that they have to be able to either evidence that they have been on a higher income threshold salary before they applied, or that they have the potential to earn it. And at the moment, it's 153,600. So in other words, if you're highly skilled and you're really worth the money, then you must be able to attract that sort of salary or above. Otherwise, then you're not that highly skilled, or you're not that great. Now, well, sorry, I've put something in there that I shouldn't have. Sorry, guys. So the program is intended to attract the best talent from around the world and to create opportunities for Australians by transferring their skills, promoting innovation and creating job opportunities. And the program, like I said before, is for a permanent visa. To express interest for priority processing within the program, a candidate will be highly skilled in one of the 7 target sectors and be able to command the salary that I've mentioned previously. But they also look at highly skilled, highly graded recent PhD or master's graduates. So if somebody has just graduated with a PhD or a master's where their average grade score has been over 80%, they can also apply under the Independent Global Talent Visa. So in other words, they just want the best of the best, and they will do everything to try and get them here. And it's a good program because I mean, in the past, you've had very highly skilled people that have had no pathway and they've ended up, coming here, they do all their study and then they have to leave, which is, a loss to Australia, skills and experience and expertise. So as I said, the benefit of the visa is that it's permanent, fast track, there's less red tape, no additional fees for employers such as the SAP levy, which is also a very attractive, part of the visa. And there's no restrictions on employment or location. Applicants for this visa need to be exceptional in the context of the Global Talent Visa. This means that they have to be innovative, entrepreneurial, highly skilled in a particular area, have contributed internationally in their field of expertise, bring global connections and business opportunities to Australia, and can quickly establish themselves. Or people that can attract and raise investment through venture capital, grant funding, or they may already be in Australia and working for an employer. Like I said, the salary has to be above the Fair Work High Income threshold, which is 153,600. When you talk to anyone that is interested in this visa, they have to have an Australian nominator. So in other words, even though they're an independent global talent, they still have to have someone in Australia that can say, yes, we nominate this person. The nomination just means that someone in Australia who is able to themselves be recognised as highly skilled and highly recognised must be able to say, look, this person is amazing, we want them in Australia, these are their qualifications, this is their background, this is my background, and this is why I'm qualified to say that this person should come in. And without that, so the nominator can be either an individual or an organisation, but without that, there's no way that they can come in. So in reality, it seems like a very simple process, to be honest, because if you're highly skilled, if you've got the English, if you've got the high salary, if you've got a nominator, but I mean, to get it all together, it sounds simple, but when you put all that together and to try and get it into a nice package, obviously it's not that easy. Otherwise, it wouldn't be that highly skilled or that highly coveted. So, what else can I say? So the applicants need to lodge an expression of interest before anything else. If the expression of interest is acceptable, they get an invitation to apply for the visa. and then they apply under the distinguished talent. So with the distinguished talent, they have to, again, evidence health, character. They have to show evidence that they can be employable, that they can attract the sort of salary that we've mentioned, and that they're going to be able to settle in Australia and to contribute to the Australian community. So although the global talent has its own specific requirements, they then have to meet the requirements of the distinguished talent as well. So once they're invited, they can lodge the application. They must, like I said, must be able to earn that high income, have an Australian nominator, and they must be able, or they may be a graduate with honours degree, master's degree, or a PhD with a grade point average of above 80%. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Maree, while you're still there, we just had a question. Is there a definition for highly skilled?
Well, as far as I'm aware, from all the ones that I've done, is that you have to have the qualifications, and you have to have experience, and you must be able to get references that can, you know. So you have to be exceptional. So you can't just be an IT from, I don't know, from Singapore. You've got to be an IT from Singapore that has done something that is recognised internationally or nationally as something that's become exceptional in that sphere.
And do we need the nominator before the EOI? Does the EOI request that the nominator's details be entered in, or is that something that comes once the EOI has been granted?
I think that comes after the EOI has been granted. Yeah.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. Alan, over to you.
A lot of good information. Thanks. Hello, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure, first of all, to be invited by Maritime to support this session this morning. And I think it's terrific that we're actually doing that, because Maritime have taken the initiative here and want to update everyone about COVID-19. And COVID-19 has certainly shown us, all of us, everyone in this room and everyone in Australia who work in the economic space, in the labour market and the labour force, that we have almost no capacity to understand where our business is in a sustainable format going over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 years. So this landscape is going to be particularly important to understand. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to pare it down to the lowest common denominator, spend 5 minutes or so, talk about where we are in terms of net migration, and that's, whilst it seems rather innocuous, it's extraordinarily important about what happens next, because what happens next is probably, as Sarah's indicated, as Samantha's indicated, that we're probably in for a skill shortage, which is about as deep as we're ever going to get. Whilst that sounds pretty scary from the outset, there's a lot of give and take on both sides. And unfortunately, when you look at the economic aspect of skills shortages over depression, recession, pandemics, economies take an awful long time to come out of these sorts of conditions. They enter these conditions really quickly, fast, overnight, and they come out on very slowly. So it's important to understand where we're going to go with this. We've all heard lots and lots of bits and pieces on the news about temporary migrants and how they fit into the Australian migration program. Temporary migrants, there's a little bit of misnomer about temporary migrants. Temporary migrants are not just those migrants who make up temporary skilled migrants. Temporary skilled migrants are those migrants who work in economic visas, but like 482s, 494s and other types of visas, particularly what Maree was talking about. Temporary visa holders, and we've heard a lot of information about temporary visa holders, are made up of a lot of people, a lot of types of visas, particularly visitors, working holiday makers, and New Zealand citizens, and students. They're the biggest cohort. If you look at some quick figures, and this isn't an economic session, but just look at some quick figures to put this into perspective. There's only about, or they were planning on up to March 2020. Look at March 2020 in terms of the skilled temporary entrants. those 482 visas, 494s and other visas, there was 139,000 to the year in the program approved. That's not an awful lot of skilled migrants. When you look at a skilled migrant list of in temporary skilled entrants of 139 in an overall workforce, Australia's overall labour force, it's not an awful lot. What's going to happen next, though, is the predictions are going to drop to 93 at the end of December of this year. So we're going to move from 139 approvals already to probably an end rate to December 20 of 93,000. So when we talk about all those temporary visas holders going home, a lot of them were students, a lot of them were visitors, a lot of them were New Zealand citizens. And when you look at the whole NOM or the net migration movement, it's pretty telling. Since March, we've been losing about 34,000 temporary visa holders, that's all temporary visa holders, per month. If that was equated to a 12-month period, that would be 400,000 people. That's actually the number of, slightly less the number of students there are in Australia. So what we've ended up with, when you're looking at net migration, you've got to take the difference between the number of people arriving into Australia to the number of people departing. So that 34,000 a month since March for those 4 months, that's an overall net movement outcome of negative 110. So we're already 110,000 behind the 8 ball before we even begin. That's going to put in a problem. That's a potential problem for the government, because their net migration prediction for the government for 2021 was going to be positive 31,000. We're already at negative 110, and they were predicting 2021 at 31K. That's not going to happen. That is extremely optimistic and is completely unachievable. What that's going to end up with is massive skill shortage. Now, you've got to offset skill shortages with labour market. That's the supply and demand of employment of labour in the labour market. And you've got to offset that to what they call the labour force. Those are the people that are able to work or want to work or not able to work in the labour force. So if you end up with a situation of negative, and that's sustainable, what you end up with is a big cohort of what they call inactive labour force. Those are people that have skills that don't have enough skills, so they can't get jobs. People that have the skills but don't want to work in those jobs. Those people who have some skills that need to be upskilled and retrained. So all of this produces what they call a skills mismatch. The other problem is we're facing is some people in that inactive labour force have skills that employers don't want. The end result of all this is pretty simple. When JobKeeper finishes, employers are going to reassess where they are in terms of how to get back to the positive outcomes of running a business. So they're going to make a decision when JobKeeper finishes to, are they going to keep some of what they call their marginal jobs? So those people who are already still employed through JobKeeper, when JobKeeper is finished, there will be a good degree of employers saying, well, we actually don't need those now. That could see, as Sarah indicated, a rise in unemployment, and that will probably hit us about spring or summer of this year. However, it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all doom and gloom because whatever you do, you need migrants for productivity, sustainability, growth of economy. You also need migrants to build populations. Population builds economy and growth. So where do we go from here? In late March, I had a discussion with the Commonwealth in Canberra about COVID, the impact of COVID, and where we're going next with employers. And that cohort of temporary migrants, which is the skilled temporary entrants. These are these 139,000 and the predicted 93. I mean, they're predicting less than 100,000 people. It's not a big deal. Honestly, seriously, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal to the skills to the skill shortage we're going to find. There's arguments, and you hear lots of stories from politicians on both sides saying we're going to end up with 1 million people unemployed. Well, 1 million people are not going to go back to certain jobs. Either they can't go back to those jobs or they don't want to go back to their jobs. And as employers, everyone in this room will know there's going to be a certain number of those people, Australians, who were on JobKeeper, lost their jobs, and are going to go back into the workforce. But we all know what's going to happen next. A good majority of those are going to stay 10.5 minutes, and only just so they can get a job, can get some money, and then they're going to move on. And they're going to move on quickly when they eventually find the job that they want, the job that they can do, or the job that they like. So we're in for a rocky road, effectively, probably until February, March of next year. I asked the government where we placed with sponsorship agreements for employers. The message that I got from the Commonwealth in March, and as late as last week when I spoke to the Commonwealth again, is that it's very important for employers not to stop the process of putting in place post-COVID-19 measures that can produce a sustainable and strategic model for them to move forward to sponsor people in occupations they can't at the moment because of travel exemptions or because of the labour market and the labour force. These types of overarching agreements that maybe will help you with are things like standard business sponsorships and other components where you need your sponsorship agreements in place, and you need in place now. One of the issues the Commonwealth put on the table was the fact that post-COVID-19, they're expecting a proliferation of, this was a comment in March, they were expecting a proliferation of post-COVID-19 applications for, or submissions for overarching sponsorship agreements. Interesting comment last week was they haven't seen that. What they have seen is that an ever increasing amount through March, April, May, June, July and onwards. And they're absolutely surprised. But as I pointed out to them, and we had a nice discussion about this, that's not surprising because people need to get these sorts of overarching agreements in place now. If you don't, the message from the Commonwealth is that you could be behind the 8 ball quite seriously in terms of having those agreements approved and moving on. So if you're an employer thinking about a sponsorship approval of some agreement of some sort, like a SBS, standard business sponsorship, or anything else, and even and not stopping there in terms of what Maree's talking about and Samantha's talking about, you need to get them in and get them in now and set yourself up. One of the areas that Nathan's asking me to speak about, of course, is the labour agreement framework. That's extremely important. It was originally, in the format it is, it was originally brought into the system in 2007. It sort of bubbled along quite nicely, quietly until 2012, where it was overhauled. And then recently, it's now become the go-to, or one of the major go-to methods of approving 482 visas, 494s and other visa types, including those DAMAs or designated area migration agreements with states and regions in states and territories. The beauty of a labour agreement is similar to standard business sponsorships. They have terms of operation, and that's 5 years. So it's really important to make sure you have a sustainable business model. Having a sustainable business model is a lot easier said today than it was in January or this year or December last year. A sustainable business model is extraordinarily difficult to come up with in the COVID environment especially. Messages that came out of the Commonwealth on last week was something that both a number of people have spoken about already. Labour market testing. The minister's portfolio has had specific directions from the minister to look very carefully at labour market testing, not labour market or advertising as you know it. Not just advertising to meet the legislative requirements of the here and now. In the migration space, we often, and are forced to deal with matters of here and now and not those matters in the never never. And that's because it's difficult to provide quantitative data in terms of bringing the never never into some sort of alignment with what's happening here and now. However, for you to get your sponsorships across the line, to get your visa applications across the line, the government in this environment have sent out the message quite specifically via the minister. They want to make sure that this is not at the behest of Australian workers. So whilst they're still processing standard business sponsorships, overarching agreements and labour agreements, they're doing it where the applicant or the submittant has proven that they can meet the requirements, not only of the legislative requirements of advertising, but more importantly, the advertising to make sure that they can't find those skills in Australia. One of the things that they're looking at with advertising is pretty simple. There's two things. One is the legislative requirement to do it immediately prior to submissions and so on and so forth. The next thing they want to make sure is that any particular organisation proves that they have advertised for at least 12 months where they can. They may not have done that advertising in the correct format that meets the legislative requirement, but at least they've gone to the market. So what they're making sure is that to prove labour market testing, they're now going to go back through a domestic recruitment summary given to them by an employer of at least 12 months. In that process, they're going to have to be, they need to be sure that it's ongoing and continuing and meets the genuine criteria. So once your labour agreement or your standard business sponsorship or your visa application is lodged, it is really very important to make sure that the advertising continues, because if it's not continued, you fail the genuine criteria. And there's been very clear directions from the Minister to his portfolio, the Department of Home Affairs, to ensure that post-submission of an application or whatever it may be, that case officers now get labour market testing since the submission. So they'll come back to you and say, give us your latest information. If you can't prove it, unfortunately, you fall down. Labour agreements fall into a slightly different space, of course. They're still very heavily geared around a number of key pieces of legislation that deal with labour market testing, that deal with market salary rates, that deals with salary and equivalent terms and conditions of employment. Labour agreements have taken a massive swing in the last, well, since January, but really for the industry and for migration professionals, it's really only in the last couple of months that we've seen the swing take effect. And that is, let me just explain quickly that a labour agreement is a sponsorship agreement to sponsor occupations for skilled temporary entrants in occupations that you can't use the standard visa program. So if you can't use the standard 482 visa program, or you can't use the 484 visa program, you use a labour agreement where you can, if you meet certain criteria, to sponsor occupations that are not on lists, on skilled occupation lists, or you can't get through the standard process. Some of the labour agreement templates are negotiated through industry and have concessions included. Some of those concessions are actually salary concessions where you actually don't have to, meet 100% of the minimum salary. You can sometimes meet 9%. There's some of these labour agreement templates have specialised or different skill qualifications and experience criteria, which are slightly lower. Some have transition pathways to 186 or permanent residency, which, don't forget, we're all talking about occupations which you can't use the standard visa program for. So that's very important. Labour agreements are not easy to get. They're difficult. They're difficult because you're asking the minister to step away from the standard visa program and approve a labour agreement for an occupation which you're not, or you shouldn't be able to get through, or you can't get, should I say, excuse me, through the standard visa program. However, where they come into the therefore And why they're so important is that an employer uses it as a strategic document, and a very extremely important strategic document that they can then use to leverage their business in the next 5 years. Now, taking COVID into account and bearing in mind how we're going to start moving through COVID, and various ups and downs in terms of the numbers of people on the market, in the labour force, and so on and so forth. As we move through COVID, particularly in the next 12 months, if you had a labour agreement as an employer for a term of operation of 5 years, that gives you a very clear strategy over 5 years of how you can leverage this agreement and sponsor people in occupations you know very well post-COVID that you're not going to be able to fill in the skills gap, or you can't use the standard visa program. So labour agreements, whilst they're extraordinarily strategic documents for employers, they're difficult to get. They don't hand them out lightly. You need to ensure that you provide a sustainable business case and business model. You need to be in a position where you can financially support the program. And just closing on the program itself, the Minister's also currently given all his case officers some very clear instructions to assess post-COVID-19 of all applications before them, that they meet the criteria in terms of not taking jobs away from Australians. So I don't think we want to get too wrapped up in this jobs for Australians message. That's a bit silly at the end of the day, because we're effectively trying to talk about ultimately 93 or 100,000 people. It's not going to make diddly squat in terms of the number of people who work in this country. And remember, there's a lot of argy-bargy goes on about all the people, these million people are being unemployed and so on and so forth. It's a real problem. It's a recognised problem. We're not facing it by ourselves. Post-COVID-19 measures have already been introduced by similar migration programs to ours, like in Canada and in New Zealand and in the UK. We'll leave America alone in this one because they go an unusual system anyway. And they're not quite post-COVID-19 at all. Although, you know, from what you hear in the newspaper and what you read on the television, you seem to scratch your head. But anyway, all good. Let's deal with what we can deal with. Let's move forward. Do not stop. The message, of course, from me and the Commonwealth is not to stop, to move forward, to use labour agreements as much as you possibly can. Contact Mapian, they'll happy to help you. And move forward. And I think it's very important that we all just take a big deep breath, understand that we're in for big, deep skill shortages. We're going to have to move through them quickly, as best as we can in the short term. But over a year, it'll start panning out. And I think if we have this conversation, I know if we have this conversation this time next year, we can have a different conversation about how net migration affects the skilled migration program. And trying to get as many skilled people into this country as possible, and moving towards sustainable GDP. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. Thank you. And I think what Alan, was also saying there is it is business as usual for us. So if you do know you're going to have those skills shortages needed within the next couple of months, now's the time to get everything, all your ducks in a row, and get your standard business sponsorship in place. If you don't fall under the SBS program, then consider looking at a labour agreement and start preparing for that now, because that can take 6 to 12 months to process once the application's been submitted. And it does take quite a few weeks preparation time as well to get all the information and build that business case. I did get one question there from Simon. Can you explain the need for advertising for 12 months before lodgement and after? Is this new policy? So Simon, in regards to the standard business sponsorship program where you're nominating individuals on 482 visas, what the department is requesting is the normal labour market testing evidence. So you've advertised in the last 4 months prior to making the application. That's been done in 2 locations and run for a 28-day period. There's also other details that's required within the actual advertisement themselves. So what we're seeing coming out of the department of late is a further request for evidence around the genuine need for the position. So for us to be able to demonstrate and build that business case, to demonstrate that, okay, yeah, you've advertised 3 months ago, you found the person you wanted, but have you genuinely tried to fill that role with an Australian, and have you continued to advertise or have an expression of interest in place, and where is this genuine need coming from? So as well as the advertising you completed prior to the lodgement, they also want further evidence in respect of well, have you really tested the labour market? And if that's advertising that you continue to do under expressions of interest, or perhaps you have stats and figures from recruitment or placement firms that have evidence that, you know, you just can't find, you know, diesel motor mechanics or surveyors in Australia. They're the ones that we're always struggling to fill roles in, a maritime crew. You know, we need to be able to provide substantiative evidence and quantitative evidence that demonstrates that, you know, you do have the genuine need, and these are the reasons why you can't find these people, and this is why you need this individual for this particular project, or to fit in with your organization as well. In regards to the labour market testing for your labour agreement processing, and Alan, you can step in here as well, but normally you would provide evidence that you've tested the local labour market when you've lodged your labour agreement request, but you must continue to advertise for those roles that you require while the application's in train with the department.
That's absolutely key. If you stop advertising at all for any type of application that you require labour market testing, once you've lodged the application, do it at your peril, because you'll come undone. This is going to be the new norm. I'm pretty sure it's also going to get driven into policy at some particular point in time as well.
That's it. So I think we did have another question there around the labour agreement. Is the labour agreement process applicable where PR is not available due to age? So is that something, Alan, that you can build into your labour agreement request to...
Yeah, and that's the beauty of the labour agreement process, because it sits outside legislative criteria. So when you lodge a labour agreement or prepare a labour agreement, when we're doing that, we're not actually preparing it against the set of legislative criteria, unlike a standard business sponsorship or a visa subclass. So it has an unusual process of submission and assessment. So it's not assessed against or refused or approved against a set of legislative criteria. It's a subjective process. The Minister gives his portfolio, Home Affairs, certain criteria to approve labour agreements and not, dependent on a sustainable business model. One of those, one of the things that you can ask for in a labour agreement, which is not available under the standard business program, either you're on a list which is doesn't have transition to PR, or as the caller said, is beyond the age of 45. You can request a through a labour agreement age concession, again through a sustainable business model. However, if you do that, you take away the power of the Department of Home Affairs to approve it. It'll go straight to the Minister, because all concessions are requested go straight to the Minister. The ministers can, again, through his MU, ministerial unit, can either approve or refuse a PR request. But unlike the Department of Immigration, any ministerial request is not bound by time. So it could take anywhere from 1 week to 1 year to 2 years. So just bear in mind that and probably you'll find under the circumstances of COVID, some of those PR requests are going to take a little bit longer, but yes, you can do it under a labour agreement.
Wonderful. And Casey, just on your comment as well, so there is an age exemption criteria that can be met for those progressing from a 482 to a subclass 186 employer-sponsored PR under the temporary residency pathway. So if you do have someone sponsored under your SBS on a 482 who has got an occupation on the medium to long term or the regional occupation list, there is an age exemption criteria for those who are over the age of 45, whereby they must spend 3 years working for their nominated employer in their occupation while earning the Fair Work High Income threshold. So if you do have an individual over 45 who's earning the Fair Work High Income threshold, they'll have to have served 3 years with you guys.
I'll just comment that in the labour agreement space, there's multiple types of labour agreements that have different types of age exemptions. Some of them are 50 years of age, some of them are 55, some are 60. I've just got to mention two things. One thing, because I don't want to hold anybody up. Age exemptions are all pretty important at the end of the day. The ideal snapshot under the skilled migration program is someone who's between the ages of 25 and 45, have skills, employment that they can bring to Australia, and that they particularly have knowledge that they can transfer to Australian workers and upskill and uptrain them. What you're going to see today, and moving forward in the next 12 months is a number of industry labour agreements that have multiplier occupations. In other words, we've got one out at the moment. For the horticulture industry, there's 31 occupations there. This is a big list, and that's going to become the norm in the future.
Awesome. So does anyone have any other questions? I think we've answered the questions that were in the chat box. I see the time has now come to an end, so it is 9:30 here in Perth, 12:30 in the Eastern States. So I do appreciate everyone attending and hanging in to listen to our panel of experts. I do hope you've enjoyed this session. Any questions, please do let us know. We will be sending an email out tomorrow, just looking for your feedback and providing you with a link to the recorded session if any of your colleagues did miss this session. So I do appreciate your time again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you. Keep safe.